Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, good. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure, and I've enjoyed each of the different presentations since this morning. And of course, I especially enjoyed listening to David and to Bernadette, because we know each other. I met David and Bernadette back here in Rovaniemi a few years ago, when we had extensive discussions about something which I'm going to talk about today, which is this concept of resilience. I'm not so much, or I haven't yet, I wouldn't claim to be a scholar of narrativity as such, but it is something I'm very interested in, certainly. And one of the things I've always been interested in, and which I want to draw our attention to now, is when we talk about narrativity, when we look at scholarship, especially in international relations, which is using narrative as method, we're often looking at research which is designed and functioning to challenge and to critique state power. And this is obvious in the case of the way in which narrativity is intrinsic to, for example, the development of theoretical approaches and empirical approaches informed by constructivism, for example, since the 1990s. But it's an interesting fact that since the 1990s, the concept of narrative also has become very influential and very powerful within state military strategic thinking. So here you have this concept which is mobilized by IR theorists to critique state power, to critique notions of state identity and interest and so forth, but which at the same time is recuperated by strategists, military strategists of the state, to think about the strategic business of how to wage war and how to win war. The idea that to win war, you have to be able to win the story. You have to have a narrative which is convincing, both for those doing the fighting and those you want to defeat. And in terms of military strategic thinking, the classic contemporary text in this vein is a work from the first edition was in the 1990s. It came out of the RAND organization in the United States. It was written by Arkilla and Ronfeld. It was called Networks and Net Wars. And this was one of their basic arguments in that now classic text of contemporary strategic thinking. And they talked in the 90s about the ways in which, for example, the Chechens were able to beat Russia in the first war in Chechnya between 94 and 96 on account of the power of their narrative, the abilities of the Chechens to narrate the conflict in terms of a struggle for freedom against an empire, and how in turn the Russians were able to fight back against the Chechens in the Second Chechen War by winning the narrative, by telling it as a story about war against terror. And of course, we can see today, thinking about the war in Ukraine, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment, we can see immediately how important narrative is to this present conflict, not least in terms of the ways in which the Russians are clearly losing the narrative, in terms of their lack of success, their failure in being able to sell it to publics successfully as a war against terror and a war against Nazis and so on and so forth. All of these different ways of trying to tell the story have clearly failed, at least outside of Russia, for the majority of people. But what I'm really interested in is this new narrative through which the West itself is conceptualizing and telling the story of this war in Ukraine. And that is to say, as a war of and for resilience. Resilience is a concept which I've been interested in for a while. And Bernadette and David both know this. We've talked about this a lot. But yeah, what struck me looking at the war in Ukraine is how powerful this concept of resilience has been to conceptualizing the war. So to give a couple of examples, the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, gave an interview to the BBC not long ago where he talked about the extraordinary resilience of ordinary Ukrainians doing the fighting to defend their cities and towns and villages from invading Russian forces. And likewise, when we read our newspapers or engage with any kind of media representation of what's going on in Ukraine, within the West at least, we hear all the time. I certainly notice the ways in which this concept of resilience is mobilized to conceptualize the war, and conceptualize especially the agency of Ukrainians and of Ukraine. Resilient Ukraine is one of the defining cliches of the ways in which this war is being reported and the ways in which the story of this war is being told to us. But what's interesting to me, or what has become interesting doing a bit of research over the last couple of months, is the way in which this framing of the narrative in terms of resilience has been achieved not just by journalists or individual politicians like Blinken, but that it's a story which has been developed, a narrative that's been woven, especially by NATO over the last 8 years, very deliberately since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And I've been looking at the ways in which this concept of resilience and narrative of resilience has become more and more important to NATO over these last 8 years. It's introduced formally at the NATO summit in Wales in 2014, and then again in the subsequent summit in Warsaw, Poland in 2016. We start to see the gradual development of a narrative of resilience within NATO itself. The idea that the societies of the member states of NATO and their strategic partners like Ukraine have to be able to mobilize themselves to defend themselves, that the peoples of NATO cannot expect NATO itself to defend them, or should not wait for their militaries to turn up to wage war on their behalf, but should mobilize themselves to wage war for themselves, rather than them waiting for the military to come and save them. And I think this is a way of thinking about war, the purpose of war and the nature of war, which NATO has been very deliberately pushing upon NATO member states, but especially those member states that are vulnerable to Russian attack and potentially Russian invasion since 2014. And of course, this narrative has tremendous implications for how we understand what NATO is and exactly how it works. You know, NATO is most commonly associated and understood in terms of the power and influence of its founding treaty, and especially Article 5 of that treaty, the supposedly enduring and timeless principle of NATO, the idea that there is a kind of umbrella, the security umbrella, as people talk about, the idea that an attack on any member state of NATO is an attack on all, and that any individual state or member of NATO will be defended collectively by the rest of the members. This is the great image which defines certainly the public and media perception of what NATO is about. But it seems to me that with the development of this new narrative of resilience within NATO, that what we're seeing is a gradual shift within the narrative of NATO itself, gradual shift in the understanding of NATO, of what its central purpose is and how it works. Because resilience falls under Article 3 of the founding treaty of NATO, and describes the demand of NATO that each member state be resilient to resist and recover from a major shock, such as a natural disaster, failure of critical infrastructure, or a hybrid or armed attack. I'm quoting there directly from NATO's website. In other words, states in NATO need to be able today to cope by themselves and not expect other member states to come and save them. It's a fact, of course, that it took 52 years for Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty to ever be invoked, and that was on the 12th of September 2001, one day after the 9/11 attacks on the United States. In other words, the only time that it's ever been invoked was in defense of its most powerful and invulnerable member state, that is to say, the United States. And yet, since the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a significant shift in mood in non-member states, states like Finland, where I live, and in the public domain and among military and strategic experts and within the political parties and political elites. The sense is that Finland is moving fairly quickly to join NATO, all motored by the public perception of the idea that membership of NATO is going to benefit Finland's security, that it will mean getting this collective security, this guarantee of help and assistance in the event of a Russian attack. And it seems to me that there's a tremendous lack of awareness in Finland and in other countries like neighboring Sweden as to how this new narrative of resilience has actually already changed NATO and what membership in NATO really entails in the future. And it seems to me likewise that this war in Ukraine illustrates perfectly the kind of war which NATO would demand Finland to fight were it to be actually subject to Russian attack or even invasion. In other words, contrary to public perceptions, there would be no meaningful NATO intervention, no NATO boots on the ground. You could expect the same kind of cheerleading from the sidelines and logistical support which NATO has provided to Ukraine since the Russian invasion. But you could certainly expect the demand upon Finnish society for its full mobilization to participate in a war of defense against any kind of Russian invasion. Because that's precisely what NATO has been training Ukraine to do over the last 8 years under the guise of this new narrative of resilience. The effect of NATO's resilience strategy and narrative is already very evident in the Baltic states, each of which have developed resilience much further since 2014 in preparation for future Russian territorial aggression. And all of these preparations which the Baltic states have been making stress the extreme importance of making society itself willing to defend itself and to fight against Russian invaders. Strategically, resilience is also, of course, about deterrence. It's not just about the ability to respond to an attack after that attack has occurred. It's about projecting that capacity to deter potential opponents, potential enemies and attacks, which begs the question of what exactly has gone wrong in Russia such that Putin has made such an error of miscalculation in Ukraine to have invaded in the style that he has? Or was this indeed a failure of Ukrainian and NATO deterrence, a failure to project sufficient resilience, leading to a perception of Ukrainian weakness? Of course, if we read the media and the military experts, then the answer is clear. It's Putin who has massively miscalculated. Putin assumed that they could win fast by targeting the military infrastructure of Ukraine and that social and governmental collapse would quickly follow. When this didn't work, he shifted towards targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, as we continue to see every day with the bombing of residential areas, hospitals, train stations, and the deliberate killings of civilians. One question I have is how these apparent errors of Russian strategy are likely to change Russian strategy in the future. Well, I think we can speculate coherently that next time, if there is a next time, as there most likely will be, Russia will have learned from Ukrainian resilience and will start by attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure with a view to shattering the narrative of resilience of the state under attack in advance. That would seem to me to be entirely logical to assume. So to conclude, I think there are two major conclusions which can be drawn from the war in Ukraine for the future. Firstly, any state and people facing up to the prospect of Russian attack has to anticipate the likelihood that their civilians will be in the front line of attack and deliberately targeted from the outset. It's rational that Russia will do this, faced by states that are deploying resilience, social resilience, as a strategy of defense. Secondly, we can anticipate that any state and democratic people such as Finland and the Finns feeling threatened by Russia and now turning to NATO for protection will have to accept the adoption of resilience as a strategy. Joining NATO means signing up for resilience, which means ordinary civilians being in the front line of fire. The more NATO invests in resilience as a narrative and as a strategy, the more Russia will adapt to that trend. And the more European civilians will find themselves at the center of the bloody business, which is war between Russia and the West. Ukraine has been a laboratory for resilience so far. And the success of the narrative of resilience depends, of course, on the resilient, that is to say, Ukraine, winning. And the development of the war so far will no doubt increase the confidence in resilience as a narrative of war and defense within NATO itself. However, this should make democratic peoples cautious. Resilience may very well increase the strategic efficacy of a state, but by its very nature, it also makes society itself very insecure. Resilience and security are not the same thing. Resilience is social insecurity by state and strategic design. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any kind of question?
Can I have one, Mayor? I would say a quick one. So you said in the beginning that Russia made error, specifically Putin made error when it comes to the calculation of the outcome of the war, how quick it's going to be or something like that. Would you consider that also part of resilience? So what if Russia was failing in conceptualizing its resilience capabilities? Would you call it that way, or there's no such a thing as resilience when it comes to aggression and not defense?
I'm not sure if it sounds like a really great question, Benedict. I'm very sorry that I might have miscomprehended your question or not, or failed to catch it completely. You were asking, run it by me again, sorry.
Yeah, just maybe to reformulate it, because I'm also not 100% sure. But so you said that Putin made errors when it comes to the calculation of the outcome of the war. Can it also be reconceptualized as the lack of Russia's resilience? So what is about, was it about the, was it really a mistaken calculation about the outcome of the war, or was it a miscalculation about Russia's resilience when it comes to a conflict?
That's a really great question. I don't think what Russia is doing, what Putin is doing, can be called resilience. I think it's something else entirely. I don't think Russia has a concept of resilience, to be frank. It's very interesting though, because I have been to Russia a couple of times to speak about resilience, and the last time was actually at Putin's alma mater in St. Petersburg, the State University of St. Petersburg, and it was literally a workshop in which Russians were asking me and other people from Europe to explain to them what this concept of resilience is about, what it means when NATO and when the European Union talks about building the resilience of Europe. They really wanted to understand what it was all about because they didn't understand it. And I think when we're looking at Russian strategic culture, I think we're looking at a very different approach to warfare, as well, of course, as society and governance in every sense of the term. So no, I wouldn't say that Russia's failure is a failure of resilience, but I would certainly agree that Ukraine's relative success so far can be understood as an outcome of the success of its strategy of resilience. So it's not insignificance that Ukraine is winning, because it also means that resilience is winning. And there have been several key battles which I think indicate the importance of the nature of the doctrine and narrative of resilience for explaining Ukrainian military strategic successes, in particular towns where the local population and local businesses have been mobilized to participate in this heroic war of defense against the Russians. But at the same time, I want to insist upon the fact that Ukraine is winning military strategically against Russia isn't necessarily a great thing for Ukrainian society, because it comes at, as we can see, it's coming at an immense cost in terms of the loss of civilian life. So there's a cost to Ukrainian success here, which is maybe underplayed by those theorists and journalists and statespeople who are every day celebrating the resilience of Ukraine, which we need to be aware of and focus on and consider. I hope that goes some way to answering your question,
yes,
Bernadette.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was a great insight.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? If no, okay. Thank you very much, Julian, and it was good to see you again.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
I'll enjoy listening to the rest of the conference.